This talk is called How to Scratch an Itch in 200 Repos or Less. My name is SEARLS. My non-Twitter name is Justin. Feel free to call me either. This is what my face looked like in 2011, and thanks to how internet branding works, I'm now stuck with it forever. I co-founded an agency called Test Double. It's like consulting, but good. Our developers integrate with teams like yours to both get stuff done and also help imbue continuous improvement, whether that's paying down technical debt or refactoring or testing or whatever you need. And I've actually given two longer versions of this talk before, and since we're at Angular Conf, that makes this version 4.0 of the talk. You might look at the title and infer that this is a talk about creativity, and everyone's, yay, creativity is good, right. So what exactly is creativity? Well, that's a question that we're not used to answering very often. You might jump to think that maybe it's passion. You know, passion's hot right now with all these passion projects encouraging people to do stuff on the side. Of course, I don't get on board with anything until I can engage with my brands, and so the Amex passion project stood out to me, and I thought I'd go check this out. But the problem is a passion fizzles out, kind of like domain name registrations. And so this showed passion was not enough. You might say creativity is art, and certainly coding is creative, but not all code is artistic on the merits. A lot of it just is functional, regardless of whether it's creative. You might ask, is creativity vision? Like, do you look into a crystal ball to see where the cloud is and where it's going to go next? But that's really more prognostication. It doesn't actually build anything, so it's not quite vision. But these are all popular conceptions of creativity, and if you ask yourself on that basis, are you creative? Are you incredibly passionate? Do you create beautiful things? Can you see into the future? None of us would call ourselves creative. It sets a really high bar for whether or not we're creative. And yet, I feel like programming is like one of the most creative endeavors humankind's ever been able to do. And we're a totally creative industry. And it makes me really sad to know that like most of us don't consider ourselves creative people. For a long time, I didn't. But one thing that most of us can relate to is the concept of a creative spark, right? You get an idea. If you're not familiar, you know, you're walking down the street one day and then you have like an idea pop in the back of your head, and then immediately you just emit rainbows out the other end. Of course, that's not my lived experience. For a long time, for many years, creative sparks and ideas actually stressed me out because I didn't have the time or the capability. I hadn't been practicing that muscle, and so I was like, where is this coming from? Is there like a fire-breathing dragon shooting flame balls at me and I have to run, you know, or else I'll get caught up in it? I actually literally entrenched myself to hide from my own creative impulses because I didn't know what to do with them. And so I thought about that negative framing of creativity today, and I came to the conclusion that at least in my experience, creativity is kind of like a chronic illness. I know that sounds bad, but if you look back the last few years of my life since I started practicing creativity, a month goes by and then I get really mad about something on Twitter and I'm agitated, and then, I emit a new library. And then I feel a sense of relief. I pass NPM modules like kidney stones. And for me to reflect back on how I turned this sort of negative framing into a productive, positive outlet, I had to start by asking, where does my creative spark come from? And it's going to be different for everybody, but in my case, it took from 3 different places in my upbringing. The first had to do with golf. My dad was a pro-am golfer, like I saw him on TV when I was a kid, and so I spent a lot of time sitting around country clubhouses with really wealthy kids who had their whole lives figured out, and I didn't. And this taught me an invaluable trait that I call inadequacy, that I carry with it everywhere I go. I was raised in a really theology-heavy church. So when I was growing up, I was taught about, how to hold firm to really intangible concepts and argue them really passionately. And I've always been that way. In fact, nobody has ever asked my opinion because nobody's ever needed to. I just carry indignation with me wherever I go. And finally, at college, turns out I was really bad at computer science. I didn't do very well at all in classes. In fact, my computer science advisor, when I was graduating, not so subtly suggested to me that maybe I find a job where I'm not trusted to be alone with a computer. So I carry that chip on my shoulder of incompetence all over the place. And you look at this, and this is negative stuff, but there's actually a positive flip side to each of them. Inadequacy means that I have people to imitate. Indignation means that I always have something to say, I always care about something, and incompetence means that I always know that I have room to improve. It's kind of like a baked-in humility. And that turns out to be like the means and the motive and the opportunity for my own creative endeavors. And so in reflecting on this, trying to understand, like, how is it that I'm taking all this negative and toxic emotion and then turning that into positive outcomes? And how can I explain that to a group of people like yourselves so you can maybe consider, reflect, and model that in your own lives? Because if we can view creativity as this more humble, simple thing, then maybe that'll lower the bar and we'll all start to feel like, yeah, maybe we're creative people too. Also, a note, obviously, all of the things I just shared are huge markers of privilege. Not everyone gets to be raised, an affluent white boy with tons of free time with which to, develop a finely tuned sense of existential grief like I did. And yet, I think that creativity can and should be able to help everybody in this profession, no matter where you came from. And that's a big reason why we started our own agency, our own company. Because at Test Double, it's just baked into everybody's week that they have time to grow, to learn, to mentor, to work in their community, to work on open source, and to do whatever they need to do to become the best version of themselves. And if you're looking for that kind of thing at your job, I'd strongly encourage you to check out our Join page and learn a little bit about what it's like to work with us. We're always talking to people about how we can bring them in, or worst case, find them a better job than they're in now. But when I reflect on how my creative ideas form now, it's actually kind of like a game of Mad Libs, where I feel some kind of indignation, that's the starting point, but I admit that I'm incompetent, I don't have some skill, so maybe if I build it, then I'll feel less inadequate. And I have these 6 stories I'd like to share with you today. The first couple are about my incompetence. So I already told you I was bad at computer science, which made me really worried I wasn't going to be able to get a job one day. And so when I was in college, my library mentioned, hey, we need a new citation editor. You can spend as long as you want on it, but we can only pay $10 an hour. And I said, yes. So I felt at the time like my computer science stuff wasn't feeding me at all, but I also didn't know how to build applications. So maybe if I built this thing, I'd feel like I could survive the profession of being a programmer. And so I did. I built this thing called Nightsite. It was a huge success in that it supported all the major style guides, dozens of types of sources. No other free service at the time did this. I had a complete account system where you could create and export bibliographies. And over the years, millions of people have used it. It's still by far the most used software I've ever written. And what was fun is I made it all up as I went. I figured out how to make an account system. I figured out this and that because it was a safe space for me to experiment. There were a few downsides to that, of course, like it's totally insecure, all the testing was manual, it produces gigabytes of daily server warnings, and it is one 16,000 line long PHP file full of ifs and elses. But up until that point, fear of writing bad code or imperfect code or getting graded down had paralyzed me. I wasn't practicing the craft at all. And finding a safe space where it was okay to make a little bit of a mess, where working was more important than perfect, was what I needed to actually connect application development with what I was studying. So that made me feel less incompetent. There was another part in my life where I was transitioning from being a Java developer to a Ruby developer, and being a Java developer felt like a little more buttoned up and boring and lots of meetings and architecture and stuff, and Ruby was the new hotness. All my cool friends were doing Ruby, and I was really jealous. It reminded me a little bit of Mario Kart, where Java's like the earlier stages where everything's a little slower and you have really wide lanes, you have a type system that saves you. If you fall off the track, the compiler will pull you back on. But Ruby with Ruby being a dynamic programming language, it's tighter, it's faster, it's scarier. If you fall off, you fall into a deep pit and Lakitu has to pick you back up again. So Ruby's a lot scarier, and I, as a programmer, was never very confident, much less thinking about how would I cut it with dynamic programming. And at the time in Ruby, metaprogramming, like dynamically changing classes and methods at runtime, was really common. So I joined my first Ruby team terrified, surrounded by all these really cool rock star developers, and I never thought that I'd fit in or cut it. But then I looked at their tests, and I realized that even though Rubyists talk about testing a lot, there was some funky stuff in their tests, and I thought I could teach them something here. I looked at an example, this is them creating a fake dog object. This is saying, hey, the dog should be called with the wag method with the argument tail, and then you pass that to the subject under test. And I saw this, and from a mile away, I was like, first of all, there's no type awareness, so how do you know that the dog actually has a wag method? This is out of order. They're setting up their assertion before the actual action that they take. And the API here here is kind of clunky and weird, easy to forget. And so I got real mad about how Rubyists were mocking stuff, and so I said, hey, madlib, I feel mad at these mocks, but I can't metaprogram in Ruby, so maybe if I build it, I'll fit in with Rubyists. And my goal here was just to cargo cult Mockito, my favorite Java mocking library, into Ruby, and I did it. It's a little tool called Gimme, so I can pass a real dog class, it'll give me an instance, I can pass it to my subject, and then more naturally I can verify that the method was called with the right arguments. So this had type awareness, it preserved the natural test order, it had kind of cute metaprogrammy Ruby-ish APIs. Of course, nobody adopted it because nobody knew who I was, but I shopped it around at conferences to the library maintainers, and nowadays every Ruby mocking library kind of looks like this one. The lesson that I learned first and foremost was I wanted to fit in with this team, and what I had to do first was to get out of the line of fire. I had to go find some secondary thing where I could work at a slower pace, where it was lower pressure, where people didn't care so much, and impress them, and build something cool that the team could use. And in this case, I didn't go to lunch and just argue about why I hated their mocks. Having working code can really sell ideas because then you can bring to the table a demonstration, like that this is the benefit that you would get. And if you disagree, then put up or shut up and build your own thing. So building a little library on the side, even if it only takes a weekend, can sometimes be a really great way to end month-long arguments on your team. So that made me feel a lot less incompetent because I could fit in with Rubyists. As for my overall sense of inadequacy, I have a methodology that I call Midwestern programming. So this is the United States of JavaScript, and if you look at the East Coast, a lot of people's jobs are sort of obviously impressive in high finance and academia and science. And on the West Coast are all the tech companies everyone's ever heard of and all the cool apps. But in the Midwest, and today I'll include Utah into the Midwest, people do these boring back office apps. 99% of the work that I've done in my career is getting a spreadsheet onto the internet. And so these are valuable applications, but I'm not very great at cocktail parties, trying to explain intricacies of the demand response energy system or something like that. People's eyes glaze over. So I had some rock star envy. I wanted to build something cool that was public facing. So I felt like my work wasn't exciting, but I only know how to build enterprise stuff. So maybe if I build something for the public, I'll feel more appreciated or at least be able to explain what I do to my relatives. My friend Aiden at the time had a service called Mustachify Me, so that's Aiden. You could take a picture and pass it through, and it would put a mustache on the face. And I thought, that's really neat, but why doesn't the web just work like this by default? So my friend Corey and I built a Chrome extension years ago called Mustache, and would take all the images on the page, run them through Mustachify Me, and then supplant them on the browser as you browsed around online. We did it in 2 hours. We posted to a forum at 11 o'clock, went to sleep. It got 3,000 installs, tons of usage, because pro users load a lot of tabs. And so it was roughly averaging 5 million requests per hour within 3 hours of its existence. And this was interesting from Aiden's perspective because it made us frontiers in a new meme that hadn't even been invented yet called serverless architecture. Because we just destroyed his little Heroku dyno. So we had to go back to the drawing board, and what we did instead was we went directly to this API, face.com, which was a JSON API. We'd get the nose and mouth data back, and then we'd just twist the mustache over all the images on the page in byte strings. And that worked really well, too. And months passed, because once we did it, it was literally serverless, so we didn't know how many people were using it, weren't keeping track on it, until I saw in the news that face.com got acquired by Facebook. And I was like, oh, I should check up on my mustache thing. And I saw that Tested had written an article about it, and PC World had written an article about it, and it was on The Verge, and it was in the print edition of Glamour magazine. It was really for a brief moment, I felt accepted. I was drunk with power. And then the emails started pouring in. And this was not fan mail. What had happened, of course, was face.com gets shut down, and now 20,000 people's browsers don't work. Yeah, I built a popular thing, and that felt good, but I didn't benefit from that popularity whatsoever. I probably made somebody else millions of dollars, citation needed, but when you look at face.com's developer forums, 99% of them were people trying to get their mustache thing to work, and the developers were actually helping them. So I have a feeling their valuation was somewhat due to this usage. I ultimately made thousands of people probably angrier at the end than they were happy at the start, and I was left with no recourse. What am I going to do, quit my job and build an alternative face.com to keep their mustache thing working? So serverless was the lesson, right? When you put your stuff on somebody else's servers, you're trading control for convenience, and I should have thought more about that. And also, chasing after popularity without some sort of sustainable value proposition is toxic, because as soon as the going gets tough, there's just not the justification for, in this case, cleaning up after my own errors. Nevertheless, I did feel less inadequate. Another place that I feel inadequate a lot is considering myself as a thought leader, being up on stages like this one. And the problem with being a thought leader is that everyone who you've ever seen give a talk started by doing interesting work and then sharing that insight with others. Then they eventually stop doing the work, but then that runs the risk that they're going to thought lead other people off a cliff because they get too detached from the work itself. And I do this sometimes with test-driven development. That's what I talk about the most. And one day I started leading some thoughts. In fact, if you Google TDD failure, I'm the top result. I wrote this article, and it got a lot of publicity, and what I was trying to say in that article was like, this is London School TDD, it's an alternative way to think about it. Unfortunately, the guy who invented London School TDD replied and was like, no, you've got it all wrong, which made me very sad and upset because I had just gotten all this attention. And so then I put on my thought leader hat, and I thought, no, this is a marketing opportunity. I'm just going to rebrand it and call it discovery testing. So I went around the world building tools and trainings and talks, talking about discovery testing as an alternative to test-driven development, until eventually I just realized I was full of hot air. You know, I felt like, and I still feel like, TDD isn't very well understood or exploited on teams, but I'd just become a talking head at that point. So if I build something real again, maybe I'll validate some of what I'm preaching. At the time also, I'd installed a Simply Safe alarm system, a little home alarm, and when it goes off, the cops come to your house and make sure everything's okay. And I was also trying to like HomeKit-ify all of my different appliances in my house, but Simply Safe wasn't supported, so I installed this Node.js server, Homebridge, and I thought maybe if I built an adapter to Simply Safe, I could sit on my couch and say, hey Siri, turn on my alarm, just like I could with my lights. So, like usual as a programmer, I was thinking, like, how can I spend 20 hours to save myself 20 seconds? So I was like, could I build this thing in the middle? And like, does my TDD process really work for discovering how to build stuff? And so several hours later, I was pleased to find out it did, and I made a little package called Simply Safe. And it has a nice, natural, kind of like Node.js-y kind of interface. You pass the credentials, you get a client in a callback, and you can set the state. And this was a fun thing to integration test as well, because there's no like supported API. So all I had was my personal key to use, and so every time I had the failing case, Travis CI would go off, and then I'd have to like grab my keyboard and like turn off the alarm so the cops didn't come to my house. But I took my own medicine, and that felt good, and it mostly worked, and that was a relief. But honestly, I'd gone so long without validating my ideas that I'd kind of abused the platform that I'd been given to share advice with people. And my approach seemed too hand-wavy. It was too detached from reality. I had to make some tweaks. And that was a little bit concerning. I think that many people in the room, you guys are probably technical leaders on your teams or managers, and as you get more detached from the work, everything starts to seem simpler, especially when you know that you're not the one on the hook to actually, follow through on an estimate, for instance. But the experience can sort of betray us, because we're all pattern recognition machines. If you do 20 apps and they're all pretty similar, you see the 21st app, you're able to kind of jump to conclusions about a lot. But that advice is sort of rounded out and doesn't consider all the nooks and crannies and context that makes every application that we build special. So it's really important to trust the people who are closest to the work to be able to make decisions about how to do that work. And so as a thought leader, it's made me realize that I need to give advice that is free to be adjusted, or tools that are easy to extend and change, because every situation is different. And so that made me feel a lot less inadequate when it came to my role as a mentor and a teacher and a manager these days. Next, a little bit on indignation. I talk about test doubles a lot, but that's a really jargonish term. If you don't know the word test double, it's meant to evoke the kind of image of a stunt double, except for instead of a person in a plane flying around, it's a fake for a test. So assume that your application depends on the cloud, and you want to write a test, so you fake out the cloud, you make your test pass. What you just did is you replaced the cloud with a test double. Gimme, that library earlier, is an example of a test double library. And my company's name is also Test Double, which I realize now, 6 years hence, has caused a little bit of brand confusion. But it's an evergreen problem, and one we think is endemic of the sort of intersection of intentionality and technology in software. The most popular, you might have seen SignOn before. This is the most popular Test Double library for JavaScript. And over the years, what I've seen is that SignOn's API confuses a lot of developers in terms of what it's supposed to be used for. It frustrates others because the API is kind of unopinionated. It has some rough edges. And it makes people like me really upset because it's not testable the way that I would do it. I've got a lot of philosophical beef with SignOn. And so I thought and thought and thought about this and went back to the drawing board and I said, I feel like users here are in pain, but I can't beat SignOn. SignOn gets 3 million downloads a month. But maybe if I build something, I'll at least be less grouchy. I might be able to help some people in some contexts. And it was humbling because it made me realize that my whole career might hinge on just 2 or 3 concepts. I learn about something, I build a tool to help me, I share it with others, and I go right back to learning, and it's this infinite cycle. And so even if I keep coming back to this well, if I can just get better at articulating that and helping people, that's okay. I don't need to be an expert in everything. So we wrote this library called testable.js. You can install it on NPM this way. We've got a screencast introducing it called Happier TDD. We also have some comparisons against SignOn. And we built the thing, it works pretty well. Most importantly, it shares what we've learned in a clear way. It's sort of an education tool with the warnings that it produces. And it was certainly better than just being cynical and going years longer complaining about SignOn. But the lesson that I took from this experience is if you're trying to say something and your message isn't getting through, you can conclude one of 2 things. One, that the person listening is just dumb or a bozo or it's their fault, at which point that's a dead end. Or that there's something in how you're conveying it that you can continue to tweak and change. And I always default to that because I want to get better and use that sort of experience to sharpen my skills. And not winning, not being the 3 million download a month thing isn't the end of the world. It can actually be okay to just write a package that only serves a few teams as long as it's helping people. So that made me feel a little less indignant. The last project might be my favorite. As you can tell, I like emoji. But creativity is serious work, and especially in open source, where we take a lot of our weekend project dalliances, and then all of a sudden businesses come to depend on them for mission-critical infrastructure. There's this impedance mismatch, and you might have seen this story before, where you have an idea, which becomes a library, which then you get all happy and excited about. You get a lot of joy from having built this thing, but then a business comes along, and they depend on it, and then their entitled developers start demanding free work from you by opening GitHub issues and complaining, and then you're sad. And I know a lot of open source maintainers, and to a person, they their happiness is inversely proportional to the popularity of their libraries. And that's a real bummer. So I was feeling particularly exploited and exhausted at one point, but I couldn't just rage quit because I knew a lot of my open source actually supported people. But maybe if I built something that was just for fun, I could rejuvenate, find a fresh start. And so my goal with this project was to build something that no business could ever want. And so I actually designed my own programming language. It's called Emo Ruby. You might be able to infer from the name, what it does is a transpiler. It transpiles emoji down into Ruby code. So we're all gonna learn some Emo Ruby today. Here's how you define a class. This is a class called heart, defining a method called wave, and it prints hello world. And then I end the method and I end the class. To instantiate the heart, I just call that chicken with a hatchling egg thing, and then I call the wave method. So that transpiles down into this Ruby. I think this is way more intention revealing than Ruby, but. So Emo Ruby, it's real dumb. It's just for fun, but it brought me a lot of joy. And the best part is that people have opened 0 GitHub issues against it this year. So it's okay to build stuff for yourself. And I don't know if you're maybe here with a manager or something, but it's okay to build stuff for fun. Most of us became programmers because we had joy controlling stuff and automating things with our computer. And very often, especially as you get more experience, you even start to take the work home with you in the form of the open source, and everything can just feel like an albatross. So it's fun to go back and just tinker. So that definitely made me a little bit less indignant. That is, unless you follow me on Twitter and just see the salt that I spew every day at everything. All of these things were actually they were inspired by these negative traits, but over the years I've seen that those actual negative traits have sort of gone away, and I'm a more positive person now because I have this reflex where I can practice and build stuff instead of just complaining. And I think that we live in a society where negative feelings are themselves often pathologized as the problem, but usually they're a symptom of something else. If you do root cause analysis, you might maybe the root cause is that you're using the wrong tool for the job, or there's friction between how you want to work and how your team's processes go. Maybe your job just can't offer what you need right now, or maybe you have internal baggage that you need to get over. So I encourage you all to reflect on how you're feeling about stuff, and if you're honest and you accept those emotions as being valid, then your asynchronous brain's going to suck them up, and then when you go for a walk or take a shower, ideas will just come out. And my exhortation to all of you today is to find a creative outlet for those ideas and to know that it's perfectly okay and reasonable for them to have nothing to do at all with software. It's just one form that the creativity might take. So my name is SEARLS. I hope you'll tell me what you think and find me on Twitter. I'd love to be your friend and see you at the party tonight. Like I said, we need more creative types in the industry. If you'd like to learn more about TestDouble, you can check out here. Or if you're on a team and you're looking for great programmers, we're really, really great at helping teams who are trying to pay down technical debt or rescue a legacy system. And you can learn more about our agency at that URL. Most importantly, thank you so much for sharing your day, a little bit of your day with me and your time. I really appreciate it.